I'm going to do is talk about our theory. We've spent quite a bit of time in thinking through trust, trying to revise some of the classical ways and the assumptions that are normally there in literature. We'll then talk about the research design in order to test our ideas and our new framework. The ways that we can compare trust, I'm going to bring you some data, which is the first we've had from the World Values Survey, Wave 7, which is just in progress, but that's got a number of countries, so you can see what we're going to be having by the time the World Values Survey finishes next July. The new typology, which will operationalize, and then the conclusions, because as I said, this is work in progress. So when we think about our theories, essentially there are so many different ways of thinking about trust, but we know that there are at least 4 which are kind of endemic throughout the literature. The first is the classical theories in psychology and social psychology, which really says that trust, whether it's social trust primarily, but also political trust or trust between peoples, international trust, is an individual personality trait. It's about a characteristic, part of the big 5 characteristics. And so it's rather like being born an optimist or being born a pessimist. You either trust or you don't. And again, this is an early work which came about, but it's also there in the work, for example, of our colleague Eric Bolsana, who also says it's one of those things you have. You either trust or you don't. And you're born into a family that trusts or doesn't, or a society. The sociological is much more about Engelhardt, and so it's about cultural values you learn in your early childhood. So trust should be enduring, but not immutable. It should be that you, in your early experiences, through your family, through your friends, in your society, grow up to learn certain values, to trust the police, to trust the civil service, to trust your government, to trust your friends. We think about differences, for example, between Sweden and Italy, which are long-standing every time we look at it from the civic culture onwards. We know that there are these broad cultural values. In which case, trust should change by generation, but not by performance necessarily. Newer theories of cognitive psychology, decision sciences, talk about more heuristic shortcuts. It's still affective, but there are rational elements there. And obviously, the work on nudge is the sort of thing we can think about. How can you actually improve trust, and how do people come to those judgments? And then the last is the rational trust argument. This is one that became popular, I think, very much through the Russell Sage Foundation work by Margaret Levy, and also by Hardin. And this is it's also very popular in economics and behavioral economics. This is the idea that basically trust is not what's critical, it's how trust reflects performance and how it reflects trustworthiness. So we don't just need to know about the individual. Do I trust you? Do you trust me? Or do you trust government? It's about the relationship between both what your attitudes and values are and how you trust something, and then how the performance of that agent or agency works. So there should be a rational basis. So we take the last as our core starting point, and that's very interesting. Seem to be slightly a bit all over the place, but don't worry, I did this quite late. And we think about all the different theories, and obviously there are many different arguments about why trust is valued. And what we can say is that the conventional assumptions are very much focused on trust, not trustworthiness necessarily. And they basically argue that trust is valuable for social capital, that's the 1990s, and social relationships and cooperation, market economies, again, Fukuyama's work of the 1990s on that. If we trust each other, then we'll have informal ways to work together in the business world. Liberal democracy, Russ Dalton, and global governance, the more recent work that's being done. And there have been periodic waves of concern about trust, and again, it's trust, not trustworthiness in most of this work. We know about the Huntington Commission, for example, for the trilaterals, calling attention to the crisis of trust in the 1970s. Again, work of Putnam, which took off enormously in the 1990s, really hit a chord. And then today, you can't pick up a newspaper or talk to a commentator without assuming that somehow trust has eroded and gone down. And mostly, the argument is that we should lament these developments. And the Dalton, which I've got here, is just a simple encapsulation of that view, which is very well known. Citizens are going distrustful of politicians, skeptical about democratic institutions, and disillusioned with how the democratic process works. Well, is that the way to think about it? So, our definition of trust starts with the rational assumptions. A, trust B, to do X. It's about an action. It's not just, I trust the police to protect me. I trust a lawyer to defend me. I trust the government to provide public services, or I trust another country to deliver on its treaties or its cooperation or whatever it is. So we build on that. Trust is a delegative relationship. I'm asking you to do something for me. the agent, and that agent is going to act, and they're going to act out of that my interests on my behalf, not in terms of their own self-interests where there's a conflict. And we're going to look, therefore, to try to judge whether or not that agent is trustworthy, meaning what's been their past performance. But the trouble is, it's an information environment which is limited. How do I know if I meet a stranger, or if I have to get a surgeon to protect me for my heart operation? How do I know whether I can trust their skills? How do I know whether I can trust their work? So you've got divergent interests. Politicians are interested in votes. I'm interested in perhaps getting a local school built or whatever. You've got imperfect information to try and find out about the object of trust. And you've got vulnerability to risks. Fundamental issues. Do you trust a neighbour to look after your kids? Well, that's a really important choice. How do you know if they're going to trust them or not? So trust is this rational relationship, we think, but making those judgments is really difficult. And we can get them wrong with errors in very easy ways. Now, how do we judge? And we're suggesting in our theory there's two things which allows us to judge, essentially. One is your past reputation. I don't know how you're going to act in future, but I can look at what you've done in the past. How many cases, if you're a lawyer, have you got off on a court case? How many people have you killed if you're a doctor? In your government, you can look at things like the record of what they've delivered, and it provides a kind of impartial tally that gets updated with more recent information. But you basically will look at what they've done as a prediction of where they're going to go. And then the second thing, of course, the rules of the game. Because we're not just talking about an individual, we're talking about ways to protect us from laws, from procedures. So if your surgeon, for example, has an accident, then you're going to have a medical profession who can kick them out. There are certain rules of the game. Similarly, if the government doesn't perform, the argument is the institution should work and kick in, and therefore the election should kick them out. And then informal social norms should matter as well. Now, what does this mean, and why does the theory actually make a difference? So this is our core model in terms of thinking about this. On the one hand, we have, is the agent or agency performing effectively? Are they giving us economic growth if you're a government? Or are they giving us welfare benefits, or are they giving us healthcare, et cetera, et cetera? And that could be either negative or positive to make it really simple as a typology. And then we've got our trust judgments by principles, okay? So it's the relationship between the two. Now, in some cases, we're going to say that the judgments that we make about somebody's trustworthiness are correct. Essentially, they reflect it quite well. That government, if you're thinking about, for example, the Swedish welfare state, performs well, cradle to grave public services. And so, if I'm thinking that's important, and I'm looking at their things, I should be what we term a skeptical truster. Somebody who is open-minded, who's evaluating their past performance and the guardrails and thinks, okay, I can trust that or not. In which case, I'm also equally valuable, that's skeptical mistrust. So the government doesn't work, or the agent doesn't work, and you're correctly judging that you would not want to trust that person because they could be a charlatan, they could be a swindler, they could be out to steal your goods or harm your interests or whatever. Now, that's fine. What it says, by the way, normatively, is that this is important, but this is important as well. You shouldn't trust the things which are going to, you don't trust strangers if you're a kid. So you shouldn't trust, and that's fine as well, which again changes some of the normative assumptions. If trust has gone down, maybe that's fine. If the agents aren't performing as well, you're in a more dangerous environment. But we also have the opposite cases, which are the really interesting ones. And this is where we're breaking through a bit more in terms of our concepts. So on one hand, most people in the past literature, in their empirical work, have been worried about cynics. The assumption is public trust has gone down in government and in many other authorities, including, by the way, academics, but also judges and also the press and the media and so on. And therefore, people are becoming cynical. But it's false because the actual performance of the agency hasn't necessarily changed. Or indeed, it might have got better. But somehow people don't trust it. Now, that's a problem. But it's mostly a problem in established liberal democracies, which is where a lot of the work has been done. What's also important is compliant trust. And compliance is where you do trust that agent, but they're not trustworthy. They're not going to perform in your interests, so it's a false positive. So we need to explain why it is that some people manage to have both skeptical mistrust and skeptical trust. And as I said, normatively, both of these are equally valuable because they're both based on your informed judgment about how far they're going to serve your interests. But it might be that you're compliant, which is the danger, and it might be that you're cynical. Now, all this sounds very abstract and theoretical and so on. What does it actually mean? Let me just show you one way that kicked this off for me. Donald Trump. We often think of this in terms of Russia and Putin, and why do people think he's popular? Why do people love the Chinese state? Let's think about it at home. So this is the cumulative number of Trump's false and misleading claims, according to the Washington Post. Thank you. And as you can see, cumulatively it goes up. And what happens to Republicans? Nothing changes. They continue to trust them. So this is an example for us of compliant trust that is around in many, many contexts where you believe things which aren't right, which aren't truthful, which aren't effective for that particular performance. So our research design says we have to be able to measure levels of public trust in the agencies. We have to measure performance, trying to find that. And our measure for skeptical trust is the outcome of the two. It's the relationship between the two. So we've got data, and I'll just show you a little bit of it and then show you our typology. This is the World Value Survey and the European Value Survey pooled. The latest wave is in the field right now, and we're expanding it as part of our project TrustGov to cover another dozen really fairly repressive autocracies around the world. Again, I think we've done a tremendous amount of really good work in Europe, in the United States, and in many other established democracies, but we really need to push the boundaries. And we've got longitudinal waves, and we also have measures, and I've got a measure of confidence just in this paper on a range of different political agencies. In fact, there's also good measures on international trust and good measures on social trust, but we'll put that aside for the time being. And then for performance, how do we think about a benchmark? How do we know whether or not that judgment is in any way accurate? What are we going to use? So we use the World Governance Indicators by the WBI. There are, of course, 1,001 different indicators now on government performance. We're going to test more of them, for example, policy performance in other papers. Will is going to be working on that. But also there are other ways of thinking through performance, and we can create a combined good governing scale. So our results. Just to show you briefly the simple distribution, this is why it's important. Thank you. First, this is confidence in government, from low to high, on the 4-point scale, and this is confidence in parliaments from the World Value Survey. And you can immediately see the two go up together. But it's not basically the Swedens of the world, it's not the Norways of the world, it's not the Netherlands, certainly not the United States that comes out top. It's China, Bangladesh, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Indonesia, not the countries that you think normally have the best form of government. And I don't think it's simply our bias. Now, it could be that there's performance issues going on in terms of policy. China, economic growth, immense, producing millions out of poverty, but nevertheless. By the way, the colour codes are in from the Lib Dem measure in VDem, and so the green is the more democratic, the red is the more authoritarian, and you can see that there's a pattern. So we get countries down here which are low in trust in both, and yet liberal democracies. So we need to be able to explain what's happening here, and in particular why we get a number of countries at the top, and we find if we look at, for example, another indicator, confidence in the civil service, confidence in parties, again the World Value Survey, the most recent data, 2017 to 19. Again, China's up there, Kazakhstan's beating Norway, Indonesia is beating Denmark, etc. So what explains this? Well, it could be that the data is junk. It's entirely possible that somehow it's not right. Or it could be that it actually fits our typology. So this is our basic final conclusion in terms of where things are. What we've got here is that typology. So we've got people who are skeptical mistrusters. So on good governance, this is the World Bank indicators, these governments are seen as pretty poor in delivering on rule of law, procedural quality, regulation, etc., etc. And on public opinion, these are the countries where people are mistrustful. So they're mistrustful in Iraq for good reason. But the government itself, according to the indicators that we have, is not performing very well. Similarly, you can see in Bolivia, in Mexico, high levels of violence, Colombia, Peru, Nigeria. Then we have the countries up here, of course, we have the Norways of the world, because they come out top, and it's in everything I look at, Germany, etc., etc. So those are the countries where people are trusting in reasons that the government itself is performing well according to that indicator. And then we have the contrary cases. So these are the cynical mistrusters, and we can see a pattern, particularly in Latin America and post-communist Europe, where it's quite common. And then we have up here the really interesting cases, which are the China's the Bangladeshs, Pakistans, and so on. So what's going on? Quite simply, that here what you've got is people who are trusting the governance systems that aren't performing according to the other indicators as well as they should be. So people are compliant, basically going along. Now, why that is an enormous puzzle, and I'm sure all of you in the audience can think of reasons, and we're thinking of reasons. Part of the reason for giving the paper is to brainstorm and think that through. Conclusions and next steps. This is all part of a bigger book and a bigger project. It hasn't been going that long. March, I think, is when we kind of kicked off TrustGov. So it's part of a bigger book. We've got to have a lot of robustness tests because there could be many measures of government performance, policy measures, for example, about output rather than just input. We've got to expand the coverage because the World Value Survey is still in field, and therefore when we get all the other cases, that's going to be fascinating, especially some of the worst autocracies where we haven't been doing surveys. We need to test for response bias. That's one obvious explanation, that basically people in China are not telling you they love their government, they're telling you they're fearful of their government, so they are censoring themselves. We need to use focus groups to really get understanding much more about the process. If it's rational, we need to know the reasoning. To know the reasoning, you can't do that with a cross-sectional survey. And we need to use multi-level models. And we think two factors are likely to be important, and I've run through some models, but we're not yet ready to prepare to present them. One is individual factors. Are you educated? Your education should make you more skeptical and more informed and better in your judgments. Your knowledge, your political knowledge, and your interest obviously might be important. And then the task environment. If you live in a country with censorship and where propaganda is there, and state propaganda, and where there's no media pluralism, including, of course, problems of those who watch Fox television, then you're more likely to have a misjudgment in terms of how you see the procedural performance versus your own judgments. So it's all work in progress, or that was the old pattern. And we really love your ideas and thoughts and criticisms. And as I said, my colleagues are going to field all the difficult questions, and I'll leave it. Thanks very much.
Thank you.